Today on the FinTech Files, we're investigating the role and the potential of enterprise blockchain with Richard Brown, CTO at R3, a company building next-generation blockchain for business. Richard's team designed and brought to market Corda, the world's most advanced enterprise blockchain platform. Richard, welcome to the FinTech Files.
George, thanks so much for having me.
So can we start by explaining, please, what do we mean by enterprise blockchain?
Yeah, so maybe the way to start this is actually to start with the enterprise side and then come to the blockchain side, because and I guess I'm probably guilty of this because I've been so active in this space for so long. But so many people talk about the kind of work we do as if blockchain is the reason for doing it, when in reality it's it's a technological technique to solve a problem. So what's the problem? And it's one that we don't tend to think about that much. But if you think about firms, businesses, companies, they've spent so much money over decades building IT systems. They've made themselves really efficient. If you're a customer of a big firm, you probably don't think they're that efficient. You phone them up and you're in the queue for the call center forever, and then they can't find your records. But they are. They've really, really optimized how they work. They run well because they've spent so much money on technology. But if you then look at those firms in the context of the market in which they operate, you look at those firms and how they interact with each other, it's just jaw-dropping. The level of optimization and investment they've made in IT for themselves stands in such contrast to what they've managed to achieve between them. It's literally jaw-dropping in so many different markets, in so many different industries, how little commonality, integration, and consensus there is between these firms. And that's not just like an abstract thing. It's a very real problem. Imagine you are a bank lending money to another bank. You end up with at least two records. You, the lender, have a record for the deal you've done, how much you've lent, who it was to, the interest rate, and so forth. And the borrower has a record as well. But there's absolutely no certainty that you both have the same record. You may think you've done one thing, they think they've agreed to something else. And the result is you then have to spend inordinate amounts of time and money checking that you do have the same record, and then checking over time, reconciling, and so forth to make sure that you remain in sync. And you see the same thing all over the place. All these different firms who cooperate and compete in different ways, but nevertheless, need to work with each other for one reason or another. Their systems should be in sync, but they rarely are. And the IT industry has tried over many, many years to solve this problem or make it better. We've built networks like the SWIFT network, for example, in the financial services industry, financial markets, or software. There was a big thing called B2B software in the 2000s that tried to fix it. But we never really sort of achieved the same level of success that we did within firms who've become very, very successful because of their adoption of IT. So that's kind of like a problem that needs solving, and the prize if we can solve it is huge. But it was sitting there as really sort of like an inadequately solved problem until Bitcoin came on the market, came onto the scene 10, 11 years ago, and then people began to understand it more in the early 2010s and so forth. And these public blockchains had this really interesting property that they were operated by and between multiple different parties, individuals and companies who didn't necessarily know each other or fully trust each other. And yet each of these networks, all the nodes on the Bitcoin network or all the nodes on the public Ethereum network, they are cooperating to remain in sync about the data they care about. How many Bitcoin are there, who owns them, and so forth. So there's this kind of weird thing that was built to solve a completely different problem, nothing to do with business, but it solved a problem that is similar to the one business has, which is how can multiple different people and firms who need to cooperate and collaborate reach consensus and then maintain that consensus about things they care about. So to cut a long story short, the thought process, the thesis, if you like, that went into the creation of the enterprise blockchain industry was, can we take techniques from those public blockchain networks, these techniques that allow different pieces of software on different people's computers, those techniques that allow them to keep consistency and consensus with each other, can we use some of those techniques to solve these really hard problems in business where we need buyers and sellers or lenders and borrowers or different participants in the supply chain? We need them to be in sync with each other. Can we apply the public blockchain techniques to the problem of synchronizing and cooperating in enterprises in markets? So that's quite an abstract view, but that's the problem we're trying to solve. Helping firms work better together by applying techniques from the world of cryptography and from the public blockchains.
Yeah, I can think of a few industries. You mentioned, I think, capital markets. So let's get back into that. But let me ask first, how did you get into that?
It's a really interesting one, and I still feel, I feel immensely grateful to this day to I guess the trust that my former employer, IBM, put in me, and the freedom they gave me, because it was probably in about 20, I don't know the exact date, I wish I did, but 2012, 2013, where I really sort of started paying attention to the cryptocurrency space, the blockchain space as it was then. So, Bitcoin primarily, and like I guess everybody who discovers it, I went down the rabbit hole. When I discover something new, I just have to understand it completely. I just have to understand how it works. So I spent so long understanding, how does the Bitcoin network reach consensus? How is a transaction formed? I still have memories of just poring over all these posts on sites like Bitcoin Talk and so forth, really trying to understand how it worked. So I just find it intellectually fascinating from a technical perspective, but also economically and politically. At the time, now I was fascinated about how economics worked, and I guess, I have to admit, to a slight libertarian bent. So the fact that there was that going on as well, it appealed to all my biases. But then what I began to realize was, as I started to blog about it, because I was sharing my findings, I'm one of these people who learns by writing. I think by writing. I only know what I think about something after I've written about it. So I started writing about it and publishing it, and I suddenly discovered this really interesting thing. The stuff I was writing about my day job at IBM, about financial markets and banking, because they were the customers I supported, the things I was writing about them were really interesting to the Bitcoin community, because they were seeking to sort of, part of the idea there was, we can replace the banks, or we can be our own bank. And I was writing things about how payment systems worked and how security settlement systems worked. So I found an audience in the Bitcoin community by sort of putting existing banking information into their terms. And then the other way around, I started explaining and writing to a banking and financial markets audience, this is what this Bitcoin and cryptocurrency thing is. This is why you should pay attention. And I began to sort of almost build, and it wasn't just me, there were other people doing this at the time, began to build sort of theories or maybe a thesis for how some of those techniques might be relevant to business. So it was time, being in the right place, right time, the freedom and opportunity that IBM gave me to explore these ideas. And of course, it wasn't altruistic. It was very good for sales. It allowed us to spend time with customers and be relevant to them. But then, long story short, this work brought me to the attention of the founders of R3, because at the end of 2014, start of 2015, they had this audacious idea, which kind of seems utterly nuts in retrospect. It certainly seemed nuts to me at the time, which was, why don't we, so this is the founders of R3, who are industry veterans, completely immersed in financial markets with very, very good contacts and a track record of building things like industry consortia. Why can't we, the R3 founders, why can't we pull together all the world's major banks, get them to contribute to a shared pot of money, if you like, to go run some experiments and working groups and projects to figure out whether this technology could indeed be useful to us? So if you think about it, these are very talented and well-connected people, but there was nothing to sell at that point, except they were able to persuade people like me and others that if we all got together, we could do something transformational, because we have a place and a vehicle to do this work and to think it through, and the support and interest of all the banks who were both simultaneously threatened and excited by it. So David Rutter, our CEO, is a very, very impressive guy, and he was able to persuade the banks that working together was better than working apart on something that is clearly about network technology, consortia, and collaboration. And then when that came together in September 2015, I joined R3 to head up the technical work.
And somehow the banking industry is very good at pulling together and creating some things in common.
And just on that, because we spent so much time, and it wasn't me, it was the lawyers, so much time making sure that we were completely transparent about what we were doing, making sure we had very, very clear boundaries and antitrust provisions and everything, to make sure that we were doing everything completely openly and be way beyond what was required by law. Because whenever multiple firms get together, there's always some people always have a perception that things could go wrong. So it's one of the reasons, and when we'll come on to this, why Corda is open source. There's no secret. It is an open source platform that we R3 and the banking industry initially invested in and built, but it's for everyone. The code base is freely available.
I've got a lot of questions on that, but I would first like to ground it a bit and try to discover some of the real life applications that that we can execute with that. So would you tell us a few examples of what can you do with it? I understand that you can now optimize things not just internally but between businesses. So how does it work?
Yeah. So why don't I give a few examples? So maybe I'll talk about and listeners and viewers can Google these afterwards. But maybe I'll talk about four production users of Corda. So I'll talk about B3I, Spunter, HQLAX, and SDX. So let me talk about B3I. So this is an insurance project. So this is an initiative by the world's reinsurance firms and their ecosystem to massively improve the way in which complex reinsurance contracts are written and managed. So I won't go into too much detail on any of these, but the problem here is very similar to the one that I mentioned earlier, where what is reinsurance? Reinsurance is when an insurance company needs has taken on or is planning to take on a risk, but the situation they would face if the full claim came in would bankrupt them. So they act as they own the relationship with the client through the broker, but then if you like, sell parts of that policy to other insurers so they can spread the risk. So it's like insurance for insurers, if you like. But if you think about how complex that is, there are privacy requirements. The main insurer knows who the customer is and sees everything. But when they're parceling out bits of the risk to different reinsurers, the different reinsurers shouldn't necessarily know who their peers are who are taking part in this. They don't necessarily need to know the same terms, what the terms are. But they all need to be completely consistent about what is it that is actually being insured. What are the rules? Under what circumstances could you claim? And it's hard to imagine now because we're recording this during the time when I'm under lockdown in the UK. But the insurance industry, the reinsurance industry where this happens in London is, it's all done on paper to a large extent. When you walk around the city of London, where the banking and insurance companies are, there's a major road called Bishopsgate. If you're on the west of that, that's where most of the banks are, and it's pretty much automated. You go to the east, Leadenhall Market, around there, Lloyd's of London. You're on the east of Bishopsgate because everyone's carrying these massive bundles of paper. You're in the insurance world. So being able to just move that to a world where people are in sync about the data they should need to be in sync about. That's the problem B3I is solving with Corda. Quickly, HQLAX is solving a very different problem, which is all about how do you allow firms, and this is banks primarily in Europe, how do you allow them to optimize their balance sheets in a way that can be done very dynamically and quickly? So let's imagine that for various capital rules, various regulatory rules that I don't fully understand, you need to have the right balance of different government bonds on your balance sheets, and you need to be able to sort of update them and adjust them. But there's long settlement cycles. If you go through the traditional infrastructures, it can take 2-3 days to sort of to settle changes. Their idea is if we could tokenize some of these assets so they're available on a common substrate, if you like, it'd be much easier and quicker to change ownership of these without having to rely on the underlying settlement mechanisms every single time. So using some of the concepts from public blockchains around tokenization and fractionalization of assets and applying that in a regulated context. Even quicker, SDX, the Swiss Digital Exchange, is a subsidiary of the massive SIX group in Switzerland. They're building an exchange for digital assets on Corda. Again, with this idea of trying to build it freed from the constraints of some of the legacy systems that otherwise apply. But then finally, because I think this is really the sweet spot, is an awe-inspiring project in Italy where over 90% of the world's banks, 90% of Italy's banks are live on a project called Spunter. And what this is each of these banks is running a Corda node, so they've got a piece of Corda infrastructure that each day calls out to all the other banks to check that their balances and records with respect to each other are indeed in sync. So rather than having to do that manually over a process that took many, many weeks in the past, they can now do that in near real time, where each bank who thinks they've lent something to somebody else or they're holding money on behalf of the other one, they can ensure directly and automatically that it's in sync. That raises an interesting question, at least interesting to me, is, well, why couldn't they do that before? Because that's always the question we get, what's new? Why couldn't you do that before? The thing that's, I think, really interesting there is these connections are being made directly. The information isn't being mediated through some new central market infrastructure. There's no new central party that's controlling this. Clearly, there's the Italian Banking Association, and there's the SIA network who's providing connectivity, but the communication and data transfer is bilateral, peer-to-peer. You don't have to unnecessarily concentrate the business process and the data movement. So I think there's it's undeniably the case. These projects take a long time because lots of different people have to come together at once. But there's examples of this all over the place. It's just really gratifying to see this thing we imagined 5 years ago is now being used for real.
If we look at the bottom line, what sort of progress can we expect from these applications?
Yeah, that's fair because, and I am guilty of this sometimes because I like everybody, I talk about what I know, and my career before R3 was primarily supporting financial services firms at IBM, so I always use those examples. But of course, the thing that we always need to remember, of course, is ultimately what they are serving are firms, and those firms are serving individuals, and ultimately, even if you look at where is tax collected, tax may be paid by firms, but it's ultimately individuals who bear the cost of it. There's only human beings who can ultimately buy and sell things. So reducing costs and reducing friction for any industry ultimately has an advantage for consumers in the end. But you take Vanguard. I saw something last, I think it was over the weekend, how even though Vanguard has been so successful, there's still billions of dollars of investments in the US in S&P 500 trackers where the fees are 100 basis points or higher. It's like it's insane, but it also helps put things in perspective. When was Vanguard formed? In the 70s. 30 odd years later, that revolution has still not fully played out. There are still people being, if you like, still people paying way too much. But back to your question, if the synchronization of data between the Italian banks can be improved, well, immediately, who are the customers of those banks? It's individuals. Those records are updated more quickly. You look over at the supply chain and trade finance side. I've not talked about projects like Contour and Marco Polo, but there's a whole collection of other projects accelerating on Corda and other enterprise blockchains as well, which are all about ensuring faster and more effective flow of goods from suppliers to users, so that we know where they are, we know that they're being paid for on time, and ultimately, if you can make trade finance work better, goods can be shipped more quickly, and the prices or the cost for doing it can be reduced, which directly impacts individuals. But I'm not going to make a case that I'm not going to pretend that this is like solving world hunger or that blockchain is the answer to the COVID crisis. I know my place. We're here to make business run more effectively, and the impact and benefit to human beings is a second order effect. But I think that's the nature of progress. I don't apologize for it. I think that's just reality.
Let's talk a bit more about Corda, and perhaps you can tell us a bit more about how it works and how can people come on board. How does it work for someone who has interest in this technology and see some use cases?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, what is Corda? So Corda is the blockchain platform. It's the solution, if you like, that we at R3 and our members and our community built. So it is if you're familiar with Hyperledger Fabric or even Ethereum or Quorum, it's a competitor to or an equivalent to those. It is a platform for building applications that allow multiple firms to transact with each other better. So that B3I example, insurance, the solution that they've built is a Corda app, Corda application that understands reinsurance contracts, and that application uses Corda. Each of the participants in that network has a Corda node running, or it's running on a service provider for them. But each of them has a Corda node that represents their view of the world. And then the application is something they write to say, this is the thing we're synchronizing. This is what an insurance contract looks like. If this kind of contract happens, then these are the people you should synchronize with. These are the people who should approve. So the application is the business logic. And then the Corda nodes run the application, and they take care of making sure the right data gets to the right place at the right time. What makes Corda different? We put a big focus on developer productivity and usability, so you don't have to learn languages like Solidity or things like that to write your application. You can write them in languages like Java or Kotlin, sort of the languages that business developers understand. Corda is designed to really emphasize privacy. So we built it from scratch, which was hard work and it was very risky, but we built it from scratch on the basis that data just goes to those who have a need to know. Now, as I always say, that that need to know question is actually surprisingly tricky. So I never want to oversell that. But the data goes to those who need to know. And that was a fundamental decision we made, because we could have started with a design that worked like the public blockchains, and then where everything is shared with everybody for various technical reasons. We could have started there and then said, well, how can we paper over that to keep data secret? But we said it's easier just to solve the problem from scratch. So net, Corda has these differentiators, easier to use, good for business developers, focus on privacy, and it's all about, you run multiple Corda nodes, one for each participant in the process that stores their data, and then you write the application that says what that data is and who should have copies of it. So then the question is, well, who writes the applications? So you said, how can people get involved? And there's multiple ways. So if you're a developer or an architect who's just interested, go to github.com/Corda. There's the code base. You can go and explore it, play with the samples. If you are a software vendor or a startup or somebody who understands that there's a problem in a market somewhere that needs to be fixed, you could build a Corda app. So effectively, that would be a business proposition you make. You would choose to essentially, create a business, create a startup that says, I know this business problem that can be solved, and I will write a Corda app to solve it. So you figure out which customers would you need, and then you'd get them on board, and you would make money that way. We don't write the apps; our customers write the apps, and they write them because they think they can make money by solving problems for their customers. Or you could just be a user of a Corda app, and in that case, you wouldn't even know you were using it. You would be involved in a Corda network because you want to ensure your bank is in synchronization with your peers, or you want your trade finance flows to work better. So you'd be a customer of B3I or Spunter or Contour or Marco Polo or whoever it is. Sure, they're using Corda, but from your perspective, you don't care. You just care that the value they're giving you is your business runs better or you get some benefit. But if you're technical, github.com/Corda or Corda.net. And you can find out a lot more there, and Corda.net's for everyone, so you can find out more there.
Yeah, and I've spotted as well on YouTube you have a lot of educational videos.
Yes.
And from a non-developer point of view, I think it's also very enlightening how you split things up in things that can speak to different people. I just saw something about flow and states, which without being a developer, I guess maybe from the management company, for the management of a company, it's something you can understand. And then you can probably talk to your developers.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I often hear that people think there's this divide between management or commercial people and technical people, but I've never been convinced by that. I was just thinking, we're in the middle of the crisis. You listen to the CEO of AstraZeneca speak. So this is the CEO of a major firm. He's a commercial, hard-headed businessman. Okay, he's got a technical background, but he is the head of a commercial operation. But he is on top of his brief. To be successful in business, you have to understand what it is you're selling and the technical components that allow for that. And just as you say, if you are trying to improve how you communicate with your counterparts, you don't need to write the code yourself, but you need to have an understanding that, I've got some data, they've got some data, I want this to be synchronized. Whose job is it to check? Whose job is it to propose the update? You can thinking in terms of what is the flow of logic, what is the business process. Everybody understands that. My big thing is it's so easy to make this stuff look too complicated, or make it look as if, oh no, you've got to be a genius to understand it. No, that's just people trying to protect their jobs and make it sound complicated. This stuff should not be hard. Anybody with a bit of intelligence should be able to understand it. And if they can't, it's not their fault. It's the fault of the vendors and the people talking to them. It should be easy to explain.
How do you see the adoption picking up, and what drives the demand?
So I think there's a few things. So because when you're building sort of what are effectively networks, you're always trying to make sure that you really are helping build network effects, and that the investments that you or your customers make in the early days sort of pay off for them even more in the future. So there's a few things going on, which is these applications that are now rolling out. As more and more firms use them, they incrementally get more value. It's the usual sort of the more people on the network, the more valuable it is. So as we see Contour and Marco Polo and B3I growing, not only do the new customers get benefit, but the existing ones do too. So you get some sort of flywheel effect. There's then the second thing, which is, the first project is hard. You as a firm, I have to install a Corda node. You install an enterprise blockchain node, or you get someone to do it for you. That's a one-off cost. You've got to get it approved. You've got all the IT people need to say yes. But once you've done that for your first project, it's then sitting there ready for all the next ones. So you get those second order effects. And I say that because as we've worked with our customers over the last few years, our big focus has been, synchronizing data. If you and I should have the same record, let's make sure we do have the same record. But what we discovered, and it kind of seems embarrassing to say discovered because it implies we didn't know, and in reality we did. But of course, what you see when you're talking about firms is, some of the data between them should be synchronized, but there's a hell of a lot of data that absolutely should not. I've got tons of private data that you shouldn't see, and that other people shouldn't see. But of course, part of the problem that businesses have is that means everybody's got a different view of the market. So I know what my sales are, you know what your sales are, or maybe I want to buy or sell something and you want to buy or sell something. There are often lots of cases where we would love somehow to bring our different data sets together. My buy orders with your sell orders, that's an exchange, or my view of the market in yours, that's a market data problem. It would be amazing if we could bring that data together, but know that whoever is processing it to discover an insight or find a match between our orders, would know that whoever's processing it cannot cheat and cannot do anything other than what they're supposed to. Because we already know, you mentioned financial markets, there have been high profile examples of people trading on exchanges or trading on dark pools, as they're called, where their orders have been effectively, if you like, stolen by the operator of that dark pool who's traded ahead of them or sold their data to somebody else. So long story short, and I'm saying that a lot, we discovered that there are lots of cases where firms would like to reuse the infrastructures they're building to move data around and bring it to different places. But what they want is not to synchronize it with their peers. They would love to bring it to a central location for some common purpose, to find a new insight, to solve some problem, but in a way that not even the operator of that central location could see the data or influence the execution. That problem is known as confidential computing. That's different to the enterprise blockchain problem, but it's very similar. There are so many overlaps. And so we started work based on some earlier investments we've made for a different reason on a second project, which is a sister product to Corda called Conclave, which by the time this podcast goes out will actually have been shipped. It will have been launched. And Conclave is there to solve that problem. It's to allow multiple firms to bring data together to find an insight to solve a problem, but where nobody, not even the operator, can see what's happening or influence it. And so, as I see the sort of the flywheel going, we see existing Corda projects get more users. The fact you've used one Corda project makes it easier to join the next. And then this idea of solving problems for markets, it's kind of like it's an infectious idea that people are realizing is so powerful. That idea then extends as well to bringing data together to find new insights, but without giving up private data. So all those things begin to sort of compound, if you like, and it's why I'm so optimistic about where this space could go.
Yeah, this is something I've heard before on the podcast about when you manage to solve your data problem. Very often it's to solve a specific problem, but then suddenly it opens up a lot more opportunities because once the data is confidential, but also shareable and all that. Well, not just here, not just inside the organization, but between organizations. What I don't know what you can do, but I can imagine you can do a lot of things. So that's very exciting to consider. Yeah. So if we now look at first about, your own, are there any marketing challenges, or I can only wonder how you bring on board most of the Italian banks and how many interesting conversations you must have beforehand. But can you tell us a bit more about that? And
it's so take the Italian banking system. It's fascinating. It seems at the heart of every one of these projects that there need to be two things. One, there needs to be, and these people are rare, but there needs to be, in effect, a visionary leader. You see the individuals who have led that project in Italy. They are true visionaries. It's hard. They had to. I'm sure there were a lot of difficult meetings they had, a lot of knockbacks, but they could see the benefits of this happened, and so they put their careers on the line. They bet that this was the thing to do, and they pushed it forward. And you see that with all these other projects. You see things like the HQLAX example I gave. That's a startup where its founders have taken a career and financial risk to build this startup to go solve this problem. So there's always motivated visionary individuals who drive these projects. And then there's also mostly, and so take HQLAX and B3I and things like that. There's a profit motive. There has to be somebody or some entity there who gains when this succeeds. This isn't a charity. We're not doing this for the fun of it. R3 is a commercial company. Individual companies are commercial, and not always. There are some exceptions, but very often the firm who are building the apps and building the consortia, they are commercial entities as well. If they can make this work, everybody wins. R3 earns some transactional revenue. They win customers. Their customers get a better service, and that means their customers, individuals, do well at the end. It's just standard economics. There has to be a win for everybody, or it won't happen.
Yeah, and if you think of this in terms of flywheel effect, there's really a strong incentive to invest, possibly enormously in the beginning, and build something like that. That's wonderful and mind-blowing from a business perspective and from application perspective. Let's finish maybe with your outlook. There's a lot of exciting things, but what do you see? What are you most excited about in the space?
I guess a few things. So, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say Conclave. My team has been hard at work on this for so long, and it's just so exciting that this is now launched and people are able to build on it. So our confidential computing platform and the possibility that if we get this right, it could really be a game changer for the market, because we're using the same ideas as we did with Corda, which is it doesn't matter if the technology is good, although it has to be usable. Business developers have to understand it and have to be able to apply it. So, and that's where we focus. So I'm really excited about that. And then on the Corda side, I'm just really excited by the fact that these projects are live and then they're growing. So I think back to 2015 when we were imagining, most projects like this fail. Most startups fail. R3 was a startup back then. Most new products are just met with indifference and go nowhere. So I have to keep reminding myself just how vanishingly unlikely it was that we would get to this point. So I'm just excited to see that even through lockdown, even through all the difficulties that caused for everybody, these projects are successful. So it's so exciting.
Wonderful. I think that's a great conclusion. Maybe just a quick lighthearted question to finish, a personal one. What would you do if you were to choose a different career path?
I don't know. I find, so both my parents were trained teachers. They're retired now, but they were both teachers. And I wonder whether I may have caught something from them, in my DNA, where I find that, if I'm being honest with myself, I don't have a huge number of truly original thoughts. Where I think that I'm particularly good, I think, is taking ideas of others and explaining them in a way that's easier for everybody else to understand. So if I think about Corda, the key engineering of that came from Mike Hearn and the engineering team, and similarly with Conclave. So I kind of think that, maybe if I was going to focus on the thing I'm good at, it's taking complex concepts and explaining them and putting them into context. So I don't know whether I'd be a teacher or whether somebody whose job it is to explain things in newspapers or something. But I enjoy doing that, and I think it's where I can add value. So yeah, probably something like that. But at the same time, working for a successful startup at least I think it's probably compared to being a teacher, it may be that teaching is very, very stressful. Not that my job isn't, but I still how stressful my mum was.
Especially these days. But I think you are teaching us, and it was a great lesson in enterprise blockchain and what Corda can do. So thank you so much, Richard. That was really great to speak to you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, George. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and thank you to our guests who make this possible. Subscribe to never miss an episode.